Parshat Korach, on separating from community. Parshat Korach refers to the figure of Korach who incites a mutiny against Moses and Aaron in Numbers 16:1. We are told that this is a populist uprising in which 250 distinguished members of Bnei Israel join Korach in challenging the leadership of Moses and Aaron. "You have gone too far," they cry out to Moses and Aaron. "Why do you raise yourself above the Lord's congregation?" Things do not end well for Korach and his associates. The earth swallows them and their families, including women and children and all their possessions. It's a disturbing, almost cinematic moment. They went down alive into Sheol with all that belonged to them. The earth closed over them and they vanished from the midst of the congregation. Other followers of Korach are consumed by fire. Harrowing stuff. Today I want to focus on a moment that happens before all the death and carnage of this Parsha. In Numbers 16:21, the followers of Korach are laying out incense in an attempt to challenge the religious authority of Moshe and Aaron. God speaks to Moses and Aaron, saying, "Stand back from this community, that I may annihilate them in an instant." The command that JPS translates as "stand back" is hivadlu, literally, separate yourselves. God is very clear that Moses and Aaron must separate themselves from the mutinous faction, which will shortly be destroyed. This disturbing interlude invites important questions about when we should separate ourselves from community and when we should not. In many ways, God's is a shocking command: separate yourselves. When we think of Am Yisrael, we think of a strong collective commitment to peoplehood. In Pirkei Avot, the great Rabbi Hillel reminds us, do not separate yourself from the community. Rather, we should share each other's traumas and concerns, each other's celebrations and joys, and live our days in community and solidarity with our fellow Jews. It's especially lamentable to separate yourself from community for arrogant reasons. Hillel suggests as much, given that the next words he utters in this quote from Pirkei Avot are, "Do not trust in yourself until the day of your death. Do not judge your fellow man until you have reached his place." In these utterances, I hear him challenging us. What makes us so great to stand alone? We need to humble ourselves. We don't want to become so ideologically rigid that we can't exist in community because of some ideological purity that makes us allergic to coexisting with people who think differently than us. It's so easy to fall into the trap of extreme righteousness and say, I'm not coexisting in community with people whose beliefs diverge from my own. It's also a profound loss to operate this way. In fact, separation born from ideological purity is exactly how the episode with Korach begins, with him separating from Bnei Israel out of his own ideology. V'yikach Korach, the Parsha opens. Literally, this means Korach took. But Rashi understands this verse as Korach separating himself from out of the community so that he could protest the priesthood to which Moses had appointed Aaron. You might say then that Korach has already separated himself many verses before Numbers 16:21. Our Parsha clearly asserts that there is time for separation just as there's a time for cohesiveness. God commanding Moses to separate himself from Korach and his followers reminds us that when the motives of others are not good and productive, we really do need to separate ourselves, often to keep ourselves safe. For example, you can't tell a vulnerable person to simply stay in community that actively hurts them and refuses to acknowledge or make amends for that hurt. More on this later. Moses and Aaron need to separate Korach because God feels this faction is destructive beyond repair. I think it might be helpful at this point to consider 5 different categories of people that we find ourselves operating in relation to. The first is confidants. These are people we trust deeply and completely, people we can be vulnerable with. The second is allies. These are individuals that you can't be totally vulnerable and open with because they aren't confidants, but we want to remain close and supportive of each other, even if we must keep our guard up a little bit. Then we reach what I'd call the neutral zone. These are people who are not allies, but neither are they opposition. It's especially important to not demonize such people for what might seem like apathy. Perhaps they're confused or in the process of figuring out what they believe. The fourth category is that of opposition. However, I want to be clear that there's a type of opposition that may be generative and productive. They're not allies, and they're certainly not neutral, as they do take a stand in opposition to ours. But it's important to stay in community with such people. This is exactly what the Talmud tells us to do. After all, so much important discussion happens in the form of healthy, respectful dissent. Think, for example, of the great rabbinic tradition of machloket, which is a rabbinic dispute usually about a halachic issue. In fact, Hillel, whom we quoted above, was famous for getting into machloket with another rabbi of the Mishnah, Rabbi Shammai. The Mishnah understands the importance of healthy, well-intentioned opposition. Pirkei Avot tells us that every dispute, every machloket that is for the sake of heaven, l'shem shemayim, will in the end endure. But one that is not for the sake of heaven will not endure. What's an example of a dispute that is for the sake of heaven? Pirkei Avot's answer, such was the dispute of Hillel and Shammai. And what of a dispute that is not for the sake of heaven? Pirkei Avot tells us, such was the dispute of Korach and all his congregation. This brings us to our fifth and final category of people, destroyers. This is the danger zone of opposition. It's destructive. It's not for the sake of heaven. Destroyers are people who bring more heat than light. We can't trust their motives because they seek to tear down, not build up. Yes, we must separate from such people, but also we must be very judicious about whom we put in this category. We cannot be naive about the fact that there are people out in the world who truly seek to hurt us. Deciding whether to remain in community with someone is a profound choice. All of us are navigating so many relationships at any given time. Family, love, work, community, social justice movements, congregations. It's hard to know when to stay connected and when to separate. Of course, there's a real and deep value to promoting shalom, peace and completeness, and trying to ease tension so that people can coexist. But there's also a real need to learn the art of mindful separation by helping people transition out of dangerous spaces. For example, when people need to leave ultra-Orthodox communities, perhaps because they are queer or because, God forbid, they were abused, we need to help them leave. We need to understand that separating themselves from their closed communities can be an act of self-preservation, and that a person leaving may need help transitioning into mainstream society. As some of you may know, leaving these sects is a huge challenge. Many folks brought up in the ultra-Orthodox world speak only Yiddish and can't get jobs where they must speak English, or even, in the cases of Israeli communities, modern Hebrew. Some in these ultra-Orthodox communities might levy Pirkei Avot at a person trying to leave. Don't separate yourself from the community. And yet the choice of total separation might be the only way a person can survive emotionally, mentally, even physically. Conversely, when it comes to the American penal system, the approach is often to immediately put people in the category of destroyer, separating them from society in the form of incarceration. To be clear, there are absolutely people whom we need to separate from society because they put us all in danger. We do need incarceration, but there are also many people who commit crimes that do not make society less safe. For example, there's increasing discussion about looking into alternatives to incarceration for nonviolent drug offenders who can be treated as victims of a disease rather than criminals. Given that, as of 2012, there were more than 6 million incarcerated people in the United States, more people than were in the gulags under Stalin, it's clear that we need to reevaluate our assumption that all criminals, not just dangerous ones, must be fully separated from society. There's a difficult point to consider here within foreign policy as well. What countries should be in coalition with? China has a Uyghur genocide and many other human rights violations, but you can't ignore them and not have dialogue. Qatar has horrible human rights violations with queer people and women, but they're negotiating a hostage deal. How do we nationally stay in relationship with countries doing horrible things to people when the loss of their partnership is also so big? There are times where the stakes are so high, too high, and that's usually when it has to do with collectives rather than individuals. Recall that God had to command Moshe and Aaron to separate themselves from Korach and his followers. So too should we be hesitant to separate ourselves from our sisters, brothers, and siblings, and also hesitant when the risks are very high for human dignity and peace. The disturbing, painful Parsha of Korach is a complicated one that gets at some tricky issues about what it means to be in community. It teaches us that total separation may be necessary, but it is always a last resort. Shabbat Shalom.